Gandalf the Grey was a Maya, one of the 5 Istari sent to Middle-earth by the Valar in the Third Age. Gandalf was instrumental in bringing about the demise of Sauron, chiefly by encouraging others and dispensing his wisdom at pivotal times. Originally called Olorin, he was accounted as the wisest of the Maiar. He was created by Eru Ilúvatar before the music of the Ainur. At the beginning of time, he was amongst the Ainur who entered into Ea, the world that is. In his youth, he became one of the Maiar who served Manwë, Varda, Irmo, and Nienna. He was associated with light and fire, much like Varda, but he spent a lot of time in the gardens of Vala Irmo, sometimes called Lorien. After the Valar discovered the Firstborn, the primeval elves at Cuiviénen, Olorin was sent there as one of the 5 gardens to guard elves from the forces of Melkor. He remained with the elves and later accompanied the Eldar on the great journey west. He loved the elves, and throughout his early life he walked unseen among them or wore a guise of an elf, and he sent them fair visions into their hearts and made them wiser. Throughout his existence he followed the example of Nienna, taking pity on the sorrows of the children of Ilúvatar and driving those who listened to him out of despair. During the Third Age, while Sauron's dark spirit of malice was increasing its grip over Middle-earth, the Valar decided to send help to 3 peoples, the Istari, called wizards in Middle-earth, missionaries from among the Maiar, to go to Middle-earth and help the peoples face the darkness. Manwë selected Olorin, who was nervous at first and did not wish to go, as he deemed himself too weak and feared the power of Sauron. Manwë understood, but told Olorin, however, that such was a reason why he should go to overcome that fear. Furthermore, the One Ring, the center point of much of Sauron's power, presumably still existed somewhere in Middle-earth. Thus Olorin submitted to the will of Manwë. Manwë insisted at first that Olorin should go as the third, but Varda convinced him to send Olorin as the second Istari instead. He agreed, and prepared for Olorin's departure from the Undying Lands with the other 4 wizards, him arriving to Mithlond shortly after Curomo, and about the same time that the necromancer appeared in Mirkwood. Olorin clothed himself in the form of an old man, a figure strongly built and with broad shoulders, though shorter than the average of men, and now stooped with age, leaning on a thick, rough-cut staff as he trudged along. His hat was blue, wide-brimmed, with a pointed conical crown. He wore a long grey cloak, but this would not reach much below his knees. It was of an elven silver-grey hue, though tarnished by wear. A silver scarf he wore, over which a white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots were on his feet. At Mithlond was Olorin welcomed by Glorfindel, his friend from Valinor, who was sent to Middle-earth earlier on a similar mission, and Cíadan, the shipwright, who possessed Narya, one of 3 elven rings of power. Cíadan divined in Olorin a sense of strength and power despite his appearance, deeming him the greatest spirit and the wisest out of all of the wizards that came from the west. Cíadan gave Narya to Olorin with a prediction of his future struggles with evil, and a promise that it would support and aid him in his labors. The reasoning being, "But as for me, my heart is with the sea, and I will dwell by the grey shores until the last ship sails. I will await you." Thus Olorin began his sojourn in Middle-earth, and over many centuries he walked among the elves, men, dwarfs, and hobbits as a stranger, wanderer, and counselor, learning from different peoples and teaching them what he could. Unlike Saruman, Olorin did not take up a single permanent residence. He also never went to the east and restricted his activities to the westlands of Middle-earth, where the remnants of the Dúnedain and the Eldar remained to oppose Sauron. He was known by many names during the long years of his wandering in Middle-earth. Elves named him Mithrandir, the Grey Pilgrim, while the men of Arnor named him Gandalf, which became his most common name, meaning an elf with staff. This name he used the most, and has given it when asked. He was also known as Incanus in the south, and Tarquin to the dwarfs. Only later did he reveal himself as one of the Istari, and eventually became known as not only the wisest, but also the most powerful individual in that order. Gandalf, as he called himself now, was always quick to anger and equally quick to laugh. His deep wisdom clearly derived from the patience he learned in Valinor, just as his care for all creatures of goodwill must have come from his strong sense of pity for the weak. Both his patience and his sense of pity were revealed again and again, extending even to the servants of his enemies. Keen observers of Gandalf often detected a veiled power, usually revealed in his eyes, which appeared deep and wise. He was alternately affectionate and brusque. He often surprised others with his bluntness when time was of the essence. Gandalf consistently upbraided foolish behavior, but also richly rewarded those who acted with good intentions. The trust of the Valar in him was manifested in him being given the Elfstone of Erendil by Yavanna to bring it back to the peoples of Middle-earth. This was to be a token that the Valar had not forsaken them. Gandalf gave it to Galadriel, another bearer of one of the three elven rings, and mighty among the Eldar, upon meeting her, while remarking prophetically that she would in turn pass it to an individual who would also be called Elessar. Around 100 years after Gandalf's arrival, the Istari and the Eldar discovered that some evil entity resided at Dol Guldur in Mirkwood. Dark shapes moved in the forest, and evil began to multiply in the woods. Some thought a Nazgul had returned to torment the world, or some new evil was arising. Gandalf was unsure, and feared that perhaps Sauron himself might have returned. Over the next 200 years, the evil continued to grow and spread, as well as the source directing it. Orcs were multiplying in the Misty Mountains and elsewhere. The Witch King, the mightiest of the Nazgul, had built a fortress in Angmar in the northern wastelands and waged unending wars against the kingdom of Arnor. Moria and Minas Ithil fell under the shadow, while other wars, plagues, and catastrophes occurred across Middle-earth. Then Gandalf went to Dol Guldur to explore and discover its secret. However, the entity known only as the Necromancer fled upon Gandalf's arrival, preventing Gandalf from identifying his true identity. After Gandalf's incursion, the evil there seemed to desist, and his absence allowed for some centuries of calmness. That peaceful period was known as the Watchful Peace, and lasted for almost 400 years. However, the Nazgûl had used this period to prepare for Sauron's return. Realizing the returning evil, Galadriel incited the formation and reunification of the White Council 3 years later, composed of 4 members: herself, Gandalf, Saruman, and Elrond Half-Elven, the bearer of the third of the Elven Rings. Galadriel wished Gandalf to be the chief of the council, but he refused the position, wishing to set down no roots and to maintain his independence. Saruman took this place instead, because of his vast knowledge. However, he slowly grew jealous and afraid of Gandalf, which were some of the reasons for his future betrayal. During his wanderings in Eriador, Gandalf met and befriended the isolated and secretive people of the Hobbits, in their country called the Shire. During the long winter, Gandalf came to their aid, saving a lot of them. It was then when he witnessed and admired the pity and courage the humble hobbits reserved in their hearts. Hobbits appealed to him more than even he would admit. He was amused by their nature, and they were untouched by the great evils of the world, while being more in touch with nature than men. Their agrarian lifestyle appealed to Gandalf's innate spirit and reminded him of the gardens in Valinor. He then passed onward, but nevertheless would return to visit the Shire occasionally, for respite from his errands, and to participate in the Midsummer Eve parties of the Old Took, where he impressed young hobbits with his fireworks and his stories about dragons, goblins, and princesses. He became slowly known to be responsible for so many quiet lads and lasses going off into the blue for mad adventures, as the hobbits said. He also met a relatively adventurous young hobbit named Bilbo Baggins, although he was in fact far from adventuresome at that time. The significance of this encounter never crossed his mind, though. When King Trine II, a dwarf of the royal line of the Lonely Mountain, disappeared on a journey to reconquest Erebor, Gandalf ventured on a mission to look for him. He covered many miles and took a long time to search all the lands. At some point, he entered the abandoned city of Khazad-dûm during this search. After this proved to be in vain, the wizard exited through the doors of Durin. However, this experience did not provide him the knowledge of how to open the doors from the outside. Later, his quest led him once more to Dol Guldur, this time in secrecy. There, in the dungeons, he finally found Trine, who gave the wizard his last possessions, the map and the key to Erebor. Most importantly, Gandalf found out that the necromancer was not a mere Nazgul, it was Sauron himself, and he had taken the last of the 7 rings from the Dwarf King. Sauron was gathering the remaining rings of power, and possibly searching for his lost One Ring. Gandalf escaped Dol Guldur and returned to the White Council. After relating his discoveries, he urged the council to attack Sauron while the One Ring was still lost and Sauron's power immature. But Saruman said that it was better to watch and wait, and that the One Ring had long ago rolled from Anduin to the sea. The majority of the council agreed with Saruman. Elrond later privately told Gandalf he had a foreboding that the ring would be found, and that the war to end the age was coming. Indeed, Elrond added, he feared that it would end in darkness and despair. Gandalf encouraged him, saying there were many strange chances, and that help oft shall come from the hands of the weak when the wise falter. Gandalf did not realize that Saruman now wanted the ring for himself, and was secretly searching for it along the banks of the river Anduin. As time went on, the wizard became increasingly troubled by his knowledge of Sauron's resurgent strength. He knew that Sauron was already plotting war from Dol Guldur, and that as soon as he felt strong enough, he would attack Rivendell. Unfortunately, Rivendell was the only power left to resist an attempt from Mirkwood to regain the lands of Angmar. Over the years, Gandalf became concerned about the weak state of the North. Smaug the dragon had destroyed both the kingdom under the mountain and the town of Dale, and the wizard feared that Sauron might use the desolation around Erebor to regain the northern passes in the mountains to re-establish the old lands of Angmar. Gandalf knew that an exiled dwarf king of Durin's folk, Thorin the Second Oakenshield, planned to battle against Smaug, but he knew that it would not be enough. One day, while staying for the night in Bree, Gandalf met the Dwarf King himself at the Prancing Pony Inn. Thorin initiated conversation. He had been having a strange feeling, urging him to see Gandalf. Gandalf was intrigued, for he had thought to seek out Thorin as well. They found they were taking the same road for a while, with Thorin passing through the Shire, where to Gandalf was heading. on his way to the Eret Luin, and they agreed to travel together. Thorin wanted advice, and Gandalf, in turn, wanted to discuss the dragon smoke with Thorin. Ultimately, Gandalf concocted a plan wherein Thorin could destroy Smoke and recover his family fortune, albeit with a burglar of Gandalf's own choosing. Feeling that the Hobbit should be involved, Gandalf remembered Bilbo Baggins. At first he found only Holman Cotton, as Bilbo had left on the occasion of the Elven New Year, something that persuaded Gandalf that Bilbo was the right person for the job. He visited Bilbo later, bringing along the kinsman of Thorin without any warning. In the end, Gandalf convinced the reluctant Mr. Baggins to become a burglar for Thorin. Gandalf then accompanied Thorin and company to Rivendell. During the journey, Gandalf was instrumental in saving the travelers' lives from several calamities. He saved them from a trio of stone trolls, while obtaining the legendary sword Glamdring from their troll horde. Gandalf bore the sword of Gondolin thenceforth at his side. He also helped Thorin and company throughout the Misty Mountains. When they unknowingly camped in the front porch of the goblin town, the goblins captured the whole company except Gandalf, who was able to escape the trap and then successfully follow the captives to the throne room of the Great Goblin. There he killed the Great Goblin with Glamdring and rescued the dwarfs, leading them to the exit on the other side of the mountains. It was during this adventure that Bilbo obtained his magic ring. The hobbit initially claimed he won it from the creature Gollum, while the company was under the Misty Mountains. The ring conferred invisibility on Bilbo when he wore it, and he kept this little secret even from Gandalf for some time. On their escape out, the company was saved by the great eagles of the Misty Mountains. Gandalf had once healed their king from an arrow wound, and thenceforth they became friends. The eagles picked them up and flew them to their eyries. The next day they dropped them at the ford of Kerok. Gandalf then sought the hospitality of Beorn, persuading him to welcome and host the whole company in his halls. But then he left the quest prior to its completion. After leading the company to the outskirts of the forest gate, he gave them some final advice before they entered Mirkwood, although he knew little about how lands had changed since his last travels there, and went to attend other obligations. The White Council had met under the gravest of circumstances. Sauron's vast power was returning, even without his ring. Gandalf, at last, convinced the council to attack Dol Guldur, to which even Saruman agreed, as by now he feared Sauron as a rival, and wished to delay his search for the ring. Gandalf joined his peers in assailing Dol Guldur, ridding Mirkwood of the necromancer's presence. But the Dark Lord fled to Mordor, to his long-prepared stronghold of Barad-dûr, which was already under full reconstruction, led by his most trustworthy servant, the Witch King of Angmar. When Gandalf was about to finish this task, news about what happened to Thorin's company in Mirkwood reached him, and he realized that the instructions he gave them were not followed. They had lost their way, they vanished due to the encounter with the Wood Elves, who had captured them, and then vanished again from their prison. He was anxious to get back to them as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Thorin's quest was successful. Erebor was retaken, and Smaug was killed. But when Gandalf finally arrived to the area, he found the dwarfs of Erebor and those of Iron Hills preparing for battle with the men of Lake Town, supported by the elves of Mirkwood. He joined the army of Bard the Bowman and Thranduil, the king of the Wood Elves, revealing his presence while trying to reason with Thorin, but with no positive result. Just when the battle was about to start and the first arrows were shot, Gandalf halted all the participants with a warning that the orcs and wargs were coming to claim the treasure. He invited Dain Ironfoot for counsel, and soon dwarves, elves, and men formed an alliance defeating the orcs of the Misty Mountains in the Battle of Five Armies. King Thorin was mortally wounded, though, and after his funeral and the re-establishment of the kingdom under the mountain, under the leadership of Dain, Bilbo and Gandalf left Erebor for the Shire. On the way, they celebrated Yule at Beorn's house, and then returned to Rivendell, where Gandalf discussed the events of Dol Guldur and the Lonely Mountain with Elrond. Gandalf had accomplished his immediate goal, which was to destroy Smaug, who could have been used to a disastrous effect by Sauron. A large number of orcs and wargs were also killed in the north, removing immediate threats to Rivendell and Lothlorien. But Elrond agreed that it would be better if the necromancer was banished from the world altogether. As Gandalf and Bilbo passed by the site of their former encounter with the stone trolls, they made sure to recover the gold of the troll hoard they had buried before the wizard left to perform other duties, and Bilbo returned to the Shire alone. Gandalf, for his part, found himself amazed by the hobbit, although he encountered a few of his folk already. Until then, the wise had paid no attention to hobbits at all, and knew little of them. For the rest of his sojourn in Middle-earth, Gandalf took a special interest in the little folk, particularly in the Baggins family. Years later, he and Balin, one of the dwarfs of Thorin's company, paid a visit to Bilbo, discussing the news from Erebor and the Dale. Despite the council's hopes, Sauron was not weakened by the attack at his stronghold in Mirkwood. He had foreseen the move that drove him from Dol Guldur, and his retreat was but a feint. 10 years after the assault, Sauron declared himself openly in Mordor in his rebuilt tower, while sending his servants to reoccupy his former fortress. The White Council met one last time to debate the fate of the Rings of Power. Saruman quietened his peers, claiming to have the knowledge that the One Ring was lost in the Bay of Belfalas. After their meeting, Saruman, jealous and afraid of Gandalf now, set spies to watch all his movements. This would affect also the peaceful hobbits, as from this time on, Saruman discovered their existence and noted Gandalf's interest in the Shire. As a result, he started sending agents to Bree and the South Farthing. Meanwhile, Sauron began reassembling his forces for the final blow against the West. Easterlings from Khand and beyond the Sea of Rhûn, joined by the men of Harad, reinforced his strongholds in Mordor. Orcs, trolls, and other foul beasts were multiplying, while his minions were searching the Anduin for any sign of his precious One Ring. Around this time had Gandalf met Aragorn, the hidden heir of Isildur, and soon became friends with him. From that point on, Aragorn and Gandalf often worked together towards a common end, the defeat of Sauron. He also visited Minas Tirith and was welcomed by Faramir, the son of the ruling steward Denethor II. He taught the young Dunadan a lot from his wisdom. This displeased Denethor, who ceased to trust the wizard. During this period, Gandalf visited the Shire frequently, especially his friend Bilbo Baggins and his young nephew Frodo. He noted Bilbo's unusual youthfulness, despite his advancing age. The suspicious magic ring that Bilbo had acquired during his adventure began to weigh on his mind. Gandalf recalled the deceit Bilbo used in originally claiming it for his own. Bilbo had later admitted to stealing it from Gollum. Gandalf could see that Bilbo was now very preoccupied with the ring and had begun to suspect that it was indeed a ring of power. Such unhobbit-like behavior aroused his suspicion. The matter of Gollum was always on Gandalf's mind now. What he did not know was that the creature has left its hideout. It was looking for the thief of his ring, Bilbo. The elves of Mirkwood had informed Gandalf that Gollum was traversing the forest. Then, coinciding with Sauron's declaration, Gollum apparently turned towards Mordor and was lost. Gandalf neglected the matter because he had much else to think of at that time, and still trusted Saruman's knowledge. Later, Gandalf would regret this dearly. Before leaving the Shire for good, Bilbo planned what would become known as his farewell birthday party. And at the culmination of the Hobbit's speech, Bilbo put on the mysterious ring and disappeared, as a joke on his family and neighbors. Later, as he was bidding farewell to Gandalf, who had known about his plans to leave, Bilbo began to change his mind about leaving his ring to Frodo, to which he had agreed earlier. When Gandalf tried to persuade him to leave it behind, Bilbo became hostile and accused Gandalf of trying to steal the ring for his own benefit. He even referred to the ring as his precious. Horrified by Bilbo's outburst, Gandalf stood to his full height and projected his power, frightening the hobbit. This brought Bilbo back to his senses. He apologized, admitted that the ring had been troubling him lately, and left it for Frodo. Then Bilbo and Gandalf bid each other goodbye. Before leaving the Shire, though, Gandalf emphatically warned Frodo not to use the ring at all. Gandalf had begun to suspect that the magic ring was indeed a ring of power. Around that time, Gandalf's popularity in the Shire plummeted. He was blamed for Bilbo's disappearance, and was even accused of plotting with Frodo to get a hold on Bilbo's wealth. Gandalf was keen to find out more about Bilbo's ring, so he left the Shire and resumed his search for Gollum. Desperately needing to get more information from the creature, he sought Aragorn's help to capture him. Meanwhile, the Rangers of the North were put to guard the Shire more closely, too. Gandalf showed up there 3 years later to check on Frodo and the Shire, and for the next 4 years continued to turn up, always unexpectedly, and disappearing before dawn. He continued his hunt for Gollum, with Aragorn searching the Vales of Anduin, Mirkwood, Rhovanion, and even the edges of Mordor. The search lasted 8 years, for Gandalf did not know that Gollum had been captured by Sauron. Gandalf regretted ignoring Gollum for so many years, as his trail had become cold, resulting in many dark and dangerous days, not for Gandalf alone. During one of his stays in Minas Tirith, while studying the records in the tower, Gandalf found the Scroll of Isildur. After reading it, he pieced together the missing history of the One Ring. On his way back to the Shire, he got word from the Galadrim that Aragorn had finally captured Gollum, and so he went to Mirkwood first, to meet them both. For days he interrogated Gollum in order to verify what he already suspected. A great fear came over him when he learned that Gollum had been to the fortress of Barad-dûr. Sauron had tortured Gollum and learned not only of the magic ring, but also the names Shire and Baggins. The effects Gandalf had seen on Gollum and Bilbo convinced him that Bilbo's ring was not just one of the rings of power. It was the one ruling ring of Sauron. Gandalf departed Mirkwood soon after, and left Gollum in the care of Thranduil's wood elves of northern Mirkwood. He now returned in haste to the Shire. Upon getting there, Gandalf immediately went to Frodo. There were his suspicions confirmed, and he was able to prove to Frodo that Bilbo's ring was really the ancient One Ring which the dark power of Mordor was looking for. He then told dumbfounded Frodo how he gathered much of this information by interrogating the creature Gollum, about the One Ring's history, and how Sauron would seek to regain it. Frodo exclaimed that Gollum should have been killed. Gandalf, on the other hand, speculated that perhaps Gollum would have a part to play before the end, and in any case, it was not for Frodo to decide who should live and who should die. Instructing Frodo to go to Rivendell with the ring, Gandalf told him to make arrangements to leave the Shire quietly and soon. Frodo decided to leave on his next birthday, pretending to be moving to Buckland, to which Gandalf agreed. The wizard stayed in the Shire for over 2 months, during which time he went to Sarnford and met Aragorn again, informing him of Frodo's plans. While in the Shire, he He had a sense of foreboding. In the aftermath of Sauron's assault on Osgiliath, Gandalf heard disturbing news about war in Gondor and a black shadow. He started wandering around Erebor, listening to news from the refugees who had a fear they could not speak about, until he met Radagast the Brown, who brought him a message from Saruman that he must seek him at once, and a warning that the Ringwraiths were looking for the Shire. He decided to leave for the south and left Frodo, promising him to return for his birthday farewell party in autumn, so that they would go to Rivendell together. Then he went to the Prancing Pony at Bree. Believing that he would not be able to return to Frodo in time, he wrote a letter urging him to head as soon as possible for Rivendell and seek someone called Strider, whose real name was Aragorn. That name went along with a riddle which would identify the right person. Gandalf would then try to catch up with them as soon as possible. He also instructed Barliman Butterbur to send the letter to Hobbiton and to expect Mr. Baggins to arrive at the inn under the name of Mr. Underhill. He left the prancing pony, not knowing that Barliman would forget to send the letter altogether. Soon thereafter, Gandalf arrived at Isengard. At their meeting, Saruman at last exposed his own betrayal by revealing his desire for the One Ring. He offered his old friend and helper that they take the ring for themselves and seize power from Sauron. Gandalf rejected this with horror, and thus as an enemy was imprisoned by Saruman on the pinnacle of Orthanc. Gwaihir, chief of the Great Eagles, soon arrived and helped Gandalf's escape. Gwaihir's real purpose for visiting Orthanc was to report a sighting of the Nazgul, as Radagast had appealed to him to do so earlier on. Gandalf knew he needed to return quickly to the Shire, as Frodo and the Ring were in grave danger from both Sauron's Nazguls and Saruman's treacherous desire for the ring. Gandalf hurriedly went to Rohan, desiring to find a strong steed. There he obtained Shadowfax from King Theoden, who later resented the gift. This lord of horses and Gandalf forged a special bond, and Gandalf made quick use of Shadowfax's incredible strength and endurance. They sped to the Shire. Fortunately, Frodo had already left the Shire without waiting for Gandalf and was seeking the refuge of Rivendell. Upon his arrival, Gandalf learned that the Nazgul, disguised as Black Riders, had been searching the area already. Dismayed, he set out for Bree. Barliman apologized to Gandalf for forgetting to send the letter, and was worried that the hobbits had left with Strider, the suspicious ranger. But for Gandalf, this was a hope which far exceeded his expectations. After congratulating a puzzled Barliman and blessing his beer, Gandalf slept the night at the inn, and in the morning left for Weathertop, a high point in the region, to observe the surrounding area. There he was assaulted at night by the Nazgul, but drove them off after a great battle of light and flame. These phenomena were seen by Aragorn and the hobbits from afar, although they were unaware that Gandalf was involved. Before leaving Weathertop, he marked some stones with the rune G for them to find, then fled east, drawing 4 of the Ringwraiths after him. Gandalf was able to evade the 4 Nazgul and successfully reach Rivendell. Here he was welcomed by Glorfindel, who in turn went out to search for the hobbits. Several days later, an injured Frodo arrived at the fort of Bruinen, though the Nazgul pursued him all the way there. Gandalf and Elrond joined their powers to cause a flood in Bruinen, to drown the riders, allowing Frodo some time to reach safety. Then they welcomed Glorfindel, Aragorn, and the hobbits upon their arrival. Although Frodo was mortally sick with a Morgul wound, he was still in possession of the One Ring. Elrond called a council after Frodo was healed to consider the momentous decision regarding the ring. By chance, representatives of most of the Free Peoples were in Rivendell for various reasons. At the council, Gandalf explained the others how Saruman had imprisoned him, and how the White Wizard was building his own army of orcs to rival Sauron's. Elrond and Gandalf also advised them that the ring should be destroyed in the fires of Orodruin, the Mount Doom, where it was made. Others dissented or objected, but they eventually submitted to Gandalf's plan. Ultimately, Elrond appointed the Fellowship of the Ring as 9 walkers, numerically set against Sauron's 9 Nazgul riders. The relatively small number and the composition of the Fellowship reflected the realization of Elrond and the other council members that the quest of Mount Doom would not rely upon strength of arms, but on stealth and good fortune. Gandalf was chosen to lead the company, which included Aragorn of Arnor, Boromir of Gondor, Legolas the elf, Gimli the dwarf, and the 4 hobbits: Frodo Baggins, the ring-bearer, Samwise Gamgee, Peregrine Took, and Meriadoc Brandybuck. Several obstacles stood in the company's way. The vast misty mountains had to be crossed, for Gandalf was determined not to lead the company near Isengard. Gandalf decided to take a southern route to the Redhorn Pass, and there to cross the misty mountains near Caradhras, thereby traversing the mountain range and avoiding Saruman's stronghold. When this attempt failed due to a terrible snowstorm, his only option remained to take the Fellowship through the ruins of Moria, where the remains of the great dwarven city of Khazad-dûm was now a labyrinth of abandoned tunnels under the mountains. Others in the company were also reluctant to enter the maze, as it was now the lair of orcs and something known only as Durin's Bane. At the doors of Durin, on the west side of the mountains, Gandalf, after some delay, spoke the password and led the company into the dark. Having been to Moria on an earlier perilous errand, he was somewhat familiar with the underground passages. Eventually, the party came to the chamber of Mazarbul, where Gandalf read the Book of Records, which revealed the fate of Balin, the leader of an ill-fated attempt to recolonize Khazad-dûm. Soon after, the party was attacked by orcs and forced to flee the chamber. By then, Gandalf was well aware of their location and led the party quickly toward the eastern exit. However, Durin's Bane caught up to the group at the bridge of Khazad-dûm. Gandalf and Legolas immediately realized what Durin's Bane actually was: a Balrog of Morgoth, one of the servants of the first Dark Lord. In a spectacular display of bravery, Gandalf faced the demon. "You cannot pass," he said. The orcs stood still, and dead silence fell. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass." Then he broke the bridge upon which they both stood, leaving the demon to fall into a seemingly bottomless chasm. But the Balrog's fiery whip lashed out and grasped Gandalf by the knee, causing him to fall into the very same pit. While falling, Gandalf shouted, "Fly, you fools!" and vanished into the abyss. Yet Gandalf did not die. He and the Balrog fell for a long time, and the wizard was burned by the Balrog's fire. Then they plunged into a deep lake in the depths of the mountain, which Gandalf later said was cold as the tide of death, and almost froze his heart. They fought in the water, until finally the Balrog fled into the dark tunnels, where the world was gnawed by nameless things, older even than Sauron. Restless pursuit over the course of 8 days followed. Gandalf chased the creature until it led him to the spiraling endless stair, and they climbed it up until they reached Durin's tower in the living rock of Ziraxigil, the pinnacle of the Silvertine, above the clouds upon the peak of Celebdil. There he fought the demon for 2 days and nights. The Balrog had burst into flame anew when it exited the stairs, Ice, wind, and smoke swirled about them as they dueled. In the end, Gandalf used his last measure of strength to throw his enemy down the mountainside. The Balrog broke the mountainside as it fell, and finally died. Then darkness took Gandalf, and he passed away. His spirit then left his body. His body lay on the peak, having sacrificed himself to save the Fellowship. The entire battle, from the confrontation on the bridge of Khazad-dûm to the mutual demise of Balrog and Gandalf, had taken 10 days. But Gandalf's spirit did not depart Middle-earth forever at this time yet. As the only one of the 5 Istari to stay true to his errand, Olorin was sent back to mortal lands by Eru, and he became Gandalf once again. Yet, as he was now the sole emissary of the Valar to Middle-earth, he was granted the power to reveal more of his inner Maiar strength. This naked power that lay within him was seldom used during the remainder of his time in Middle-earth, as his mission was essentially the same, to support those who opposed Sauron. Nevertheless, when Gandalf's wrath was kindled, his unveiled strength was such that few of Sauron's servants could withstand him. For 3 days was his body lying on the mountain top, before the great eagle, Windlord Gwaihir, sent by Galadriel, found him and carried him to Caras Galadon in Lothlorien, where he was healed, given a new staff from Galadriel, and clothed in white. Thus he became Gandalf the White. He soon learned that Frodo had left the Fellowship and was attempting the quest of Mount Doom alone. As Frodo was beyond his assistance now, Gandalf promptly went south to Fangorn Forest, where he met the 3 hunters, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. He provided them with additional information and messages from Galadriel, and from them, on the other hand, he received a confirmation that Sam went with Frodo. His heart was greatly gladdened to hear that Frodo had kept Sam at his side. Then he called forth Shadowfax, and rode with them to Edoras and Rohan. There he found that Saruman's spy, Grima Wormtongue, had deceived King Theoden into hopeless impotence. Gandalf quickly deposed Wormtongue and encouraged Theoden to ride west to war against Saruman. By now, Gandalf was keenly aware that the great war to end the age was beginning. If Saruman conquered Rohan, Gondor would stand alone with enemies on all sides. At Gandalf's encouragement, King Theoden went west to Helm's Deep, where he was quickly besieged in Hornburg fortress. Gandalf did not let himself be trapped there, though, and searched for Erkenbrand and the scattered forces of the Westfold instead, which he later found and led to the deep, thus breaking the siege. Meanwhile, the Ents, along with the 2 hobbits, Merry and Pippin, moved against Saruman while sending Hurons against the orcs in Helm's Deep. Their actions resulted in utter ruin of the outer walls of Isengard and the complete annihilation of Saruman's army of orcs, half-orcs, and Dunlendings. After the battle, Gandalf went to Orthanc with Theoden, Aragorn, and a small group of chosen companions. There, Saruman rejected Gandalf's offer of forgiveness with contempt. Gandalf then broke Saruman's staff and cast him from the Istari Order and the White Council. Gandalf imposed a strict Ent watch on Isengard and then advised King Theoden to ride to Gondor's defense as soon as possible. The wizard's mind had already turned to Gondor and the coming climatic battle in the east. As a reward for Pippin, who had foolishly gazed into the Palantir of Orthanc, Gandalf took the hobbit with him to Minas Tirith, the last bastion of the Free West. Soon after arriving, Gandalf confronted Denethor II, the ruling steward, and learned that while he was in despair over the death of his eldest son, Boromir, most of the preparations were done, provisions stored, evacuation of women and children in full swing, and as many reinforcements as possible called for. Surprisingly for everyone, Pippin entered the steward's service in payment of the debt that he and Merry owed, the death of Boromir in their defense. Ostensibly were the wizard and the ruler of Gondor allies, but the steward treated Gandalf with hardly hidden disrespect and suspicion. When Faramir, the steward's younger son, returned from the defense of Osgiliath and was attacked by the Nazgûl, Gandalf upon Shadowfax drove them away by revealing the power within him. Later, Faramir disclosed the wizard that Frodo and Sam were still alive and headed towards Mordor. Then Faramir left to defend the outer walls of Pelennor Fields, which were soon broken though, and the defensive force was routed. This ill-advised defense of advanced positions resulted in senseless losses, with Faramir himself receiving a wound from a poisoned dart during the retreat. Minas Tirith was soon besieged by a vast force of Mordor, composed of orcs, trolls, Southrons, Haradrim, and Easterlings, led by the Witch King of Angmar. Still, Gandalf encouraged the men of Minas Tirith to have hope, and dispelled the fear of the Ringwraiths by his very presence. Meanwhile, Sauron's catapult hurled flaming bolts upon the city. Soon the first circle of the city burned, the fires roaming unchecked. Now Denethor lost all heart, as the city burned, and his only remaining son hovered near death. He abandoned his leadership of the city forces. Gandalf then took it upon himself to direct the defense of the city fortress in cooperation with Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, the highest-ranking lord of Gondor, still available. When the gigantic battering ram Grond destroyed the ancient entrance to the city, the great gate of Minas Tirith, Gandalf placed himself alone at the ruined gateway. The Witch King appeared in the midst of the blasted gate upon a black horse and threatened Gandalf with death and oblivion. But Gandalf did not move. Seated upon Shadowfax, he defied the mightiest of Sauron's minions. However, the standoff ended inconclusively as the morning arrived along with the host of the Rohirrim. Hearing the horns of the riders of Rohan, the Witch King departed. However, Gandalf did not pursue his foe, for Pippin brought him news that Denethor was about to commit suicide in the houses of the dead, burning himself and his son Faramir to death on a pyre like the heathen kings of old. Gandalf rushed to stop this madness, and was able to save Faramir, but not Denethor, whose despair and grief had overcome his mind. Gandalf was also able to confirm his assumption regarding how it was that Denethor's will had been broken. The steward clutched another palantir, the one of Minas Tirith, in his hands as he burned. Clearly, Denethor had been using the stone's special properties for some time, extending his vision far beyond those of men's eyes, but also wrestling in thought with Sauron. Even though Sauron was unable to completely overwhelm Denethor's mind, his courage was daunted by knowledge of the vast might of Mordor. Thus the shadow entered into the capital of Gondor. Nevertheless, and against all hope, the siege was broken. Eowyn of Rohan and the hobbit Merry defeated the Witch King, whose last wail was heard by many as he was reduced to impotence. Soon after, Aragorn arrived with a large host of men from the southern fiefs upon a captured corsair fleet from Umbar. The forces of the west then utterly defeated Sauron's attacking army, relieving Minas Tirith and killing virtually all of the invaders. Gandalf's carefully laid plans and words of wisdom, along with acts of heroism not seen since the elder days, had defeated Sauron's long-prepared first move. But the attack against Minas Tirith was only one part of Sauron's plan to devastate the West and make himself the ruler of Middle-earth. Other armies moved in the north, against Erebor and the kingdom of Thranduil, as well as against Lothlorien and other strong points along the Anduin River. Still commanding vast armies of orcs and men, the Dark Lord soon would move against Gondor again. The remnants of the Edain and their allies had little hope against his almost limitless resources. Meanwhile, in Minas Tirith, Gandalf was selected by Aragorn, Imrahil, and Eomer of Rohan to be the leader of these remaining captains of the West in the coming battles. This would be the culmination of Gandalf's efforts in Middle-earth. Fully aware that the West would stand or fall on the outcome of Frodo's mission, he advised the Lord to drive northeast to the Morannon, the Black Gate of Mordor, thereby drawing Sauron's eye away from Frodo's likely location. This plan would surely result in a catastrophic loss for the outnumbered army, but it gave Frodo a chance to achieve the quest of Mount Doom. Led by Gandalf and Aragorn, the undermanned army of the West crossed the Anduin and marched to Minas Morgul and then north, pausing occasionally to announce their coming and to dispatch small numbers of men to lesser tasks. Upon arriving at the Black Gate, the forces of the West halted and prepared for battle. As they ordered their companies into place, the foul mouth of Sauron rode forth to parley with them. He revealed Frodo's mithril coat and Sam's armor-made barrow blade, and implied that their owner was captured and tortured. The emissary of Sauron then proposed that the captains of the West surrender. Gandalf, however, was undaunted, and, seizing his friend's belongings, rejected Sauron's offer. In shock, the mouth of Sauron turned back towards the Black Gate, which slowly opened to reveal a vast army of orcs and trolls advancing on the lords of the West, while countless tribes of Easterlings and other evil men attacked from the rear. Sauron's well-laid trap was sprung, cutting off all hope of survival for the small army of free peoples. Not even the coming of the great eagles could save them now. Yet Sauron himself became the victim of Gandalf's trap. Unbeknownst to all, Frodo and Sam had succeeded in scaling Mount Doom. Just when the Battle of Morannon began, Frodo stood at the cracks of doom. But the power and lure of the ring finally overcame his will, and he placed the ring upon his finger, claiming it as his own instead of destroying it. Immediately the Nazgûl were summoned by their lord, as he in terror realized his blunder. His enemies intended to destroy his ring, and him together with it. But Gandalf's foresight proved accurate once again, as the creature Gollum, who had been doggedly following the ring-bearer, seized the ring from Frodo, only to, while celebrating his reunion with his precious, unwittingly fall into the fires of Orodruin. The ring was unmade, as the fiery mountain erupted. The Tower of Barad-dûr, as well as the towers of the Teeth guarding the Black Gate, began to collapse, with their foundations crumbling. The ring-wraiths burned out like shooting stars, and Sauron was reduced to a mere shadow of malice, never to torment the world again. With Sauron gone, his forces scattered like frightened insects. The men of the West now set upon them with fury, killing the orcs while capturing most of the Easterlings and Southrons. Gandalf announced the success of the ring-bearer and the end of Sauron. The quest had been fulfilled. Seeing that victory was achieved, Gandalf then mounted Gwaihir the Eagle for a third time, and set out to search for Frodo and Samwise among the tumults of Mount Doom. To his great relief, the two were found on the slopes of Orodruin, clinging to life amid the volcanic eruptions. The great quest was over. Back in Minas Tirith, Gandalf and the remaining members of the Fellowship reunited. At the coronation of King Elessar, Gandalf, at Aragorn's request, set the crown upon the king's head and declared, "Now came the days of the king, and may they be blessed while the thrones of the Valar endure." Thus Gandalf ushered in the new age of men. Soon afterwards Gandalf led Aragorn to the high hollow on the upper slopes of Mindolluin, and there they found a sapling of the White Tree of Gondor, a sign of the renewal that was to come. After the coronation and wedding of Aragorn to Arwen, Gandalf left with the rest of the remaining fellowship on the journey home. For Gandalf, it was his last long journey in Middle-earth. His errand to Arda had been fulfilled. Sauron had been defeated. He said farewell to his friends one by one, until at last only 4 hobbits remained at his side. At the borders of the Shire, he, too, turned away. He left the hobbits to settle the affairs of the Shire themselves, for the shattered pieces of evil still remaining in the world were no longer his concern, and he rather went to talk to the moss-gatherer, meaning Tom Bombadil. What Gandalf did during the next 2 years is mostly unknown. It is possible that his long talk with Bombadil was just that long. But he also visited Rivendell at least once, and met Aragorn when the king of Gondor came north to impose his will at the lands of the Northern Kingdom. At any rate, on September 29th, he met Frodo at Midlond in Lindon, ready to take the white ship from Grey Havens over the sea to Aman. He wore Narya, the elven ring, openly on his finger now, and Shadowfax was beside him. The mighty horse was set free when Gandalf boarded the ship, to roam the lands and return home to Edoras. Gandalf's mission was over, and his homecoming after more than 2,000 years was nigh. He bade farewell to Sam, Merry, and Pippin, the latter 2 of whom he had forewarned of the passage. Then boarded the ship beside Frodo, Bilbo, Elrond, and Galadriel, and was never seen again in Middle-earth. The ship passed west upon the high sea, and then took the hidden straight path to Valinor. Gandalf became Olorin once again. There, presumably, he dwells still in the gardens of Irmo. Olorin, the wisest of the Maiar, and the only one of the Istari to return back to the blessed land, had successfully kindled the hearts of the free peoples of Middle-earth to overcome the evil of their time. In a large way, it was his victory. If you liked the video, please give it a thumb up and subscribe if you are not already, as each takes just a second to do and will be very much appreciated. See you next time.